Okay, welcome everybody. It is now noon Central Time, so we're ready to get started with our webinar. My name is Megan Weber. I'm an extension educator here at the University of Minnesota, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. We're welcoming Dr. Lucia Levers and Amit Pradhananga. They have both been working on a project where they're assessing recreationists' willingness to pay for AIS management and are going to share that work with you today. For a couple of housekeeping items, let's see, it looks like this, I don't know if you can still see the screen. First, I'll say we are all doing this remotely. I'm sure that's not a surprise to just about everyone. Typically, we're all in the same room. So if you can bear with us if we have to work through any technical issues of doing this remotely. There's the screen again. So everyone's going to be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions, those you can enter into the chat box. We'll be pulling those. Feel free to enter them at any point while Lucy or Amit are speaking, and we'll just be keeping track of those. And at the end, we'll go through a Q&A session. We have about half of the time set aside for a presentation and the other half for Q&A. So there should be lots of time to answer questions. But I will say that we have a record number of people who have registered for this webinar. So depending on how many questions come in, we may not get to all of them, but we'll do our best. If you have any technical issues, you can use the chat as well to connect with Pat Mulcahy, or you can connect with him via email at mulcahyp@umn.edu. Pat's going to be monitoring that email throughout the webinar, so feel free to reach out to him there as well. And we are recording today's webinar, so if for any reason you missed something or need to get up and walk away from the computer, we'll send out a link after we've gotten done with the closed captioning to everyone who registered so that you can watch that recording. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over. I know Lucy is here and Amit is logged in, but will be popping in and out. He most likely will become available at Q&A time. So I'll turn it over to Lucy to introduce herself, and she'll be sharing her slides.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. Happy Friday. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So hopefully this works. There we go. Okay. So as Megan said, this is a project about willingness to pay for aquatic invasive species management. This project was funded through MASER, the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. Because they had an interest in looking at some of the economic and social science side of invasive species. So Amit Pradhananga is a social scientist with the Center for Changing Landscapes. I'm an environmental scientist, but also an environmental economist at the Water Resources Center. So we have a bit of an interdisciplinary background with some natural science and some social sciences and some economics. So we were kind of excited to find an opportunity to apply some of that to AIS management and use Minnesota as our study site. There we go. Okay, so the idea here is that we know that invasive species management can restore ecosystem services. So in other words, invasive species cause damages to the environment, and those have impacts for not only the native biota, the animals and plants and stuff, but also for the people that are using those resources or just care about those resources even if they're not actually using them. But unfortunately, we don't really know a whole lot about the benefits in a monetary form. So we may know the physical benefits of managing invasive species, but we don't really know so much about how that relates in terms of how people think about it. And we don't really know how they think about environmental AIS either. So we don't know how they perceive AIS or the values that they have, or how risky they think AIS are, how important they think it is to manage AIS, those types of things. So this project was kind of getting at quantifying and analyzing these values. So the ecological, social, and economic value of invasive species damages and management as they relate to ecosystem services. So when I say as they relate to ecosystem services, those are things like navigability. Do we care how easily it is to get through a lake when we're on a boat? Do we care about the cleanliness of the water? Do we care about certain animals or species or just biodiversity in general? Or what exactly is it that we're concerned about? So we approach this in 3 different ways. So this project is actually a lot bigger than the presentation that Amit and I are doing today. So we did one section where we were interviewing watershed managers. We have another mail survey, and we have an on-site survey. So the on-site survey is what I'm going to talk about today, but I'm more than happy to answer questions about these other components if there's time. So the on-site survey means that we're actually out on a site asking people who are there. That's all that means, on-site. So it's out at lakes asking people. The 2 species that we focused on, and there's a lot of invasive species in Minnesota. I have no idea how many. Oh, I should know this. I think it's changing all the time. But many, many invasive species. The 2 that we focused on are starry stonewort and zebra mussels. So starry stonewort is a macroalgae, so a very large algae. It forms these very thick mats just below the lake surface. It makes it hard to get your boat through there. It impacts native species. It's kind of interesting stuff. You can see in my left hand in that picture, it's kind of squashed. So when you squash it, like all this viscous fluid just drains out of it. It's just these big, long tubes, essentially. The other species is zebra mussels. So zebra mussels are more common than starry stonewort, both in Minnesota and throughout the country and the world. They're an invertebrate, and they smother native mussels. So you can see in that picture, those little mussels on top of the bigger one, those are the zebra mussels. Just growing all over that thing. They also impact walleye, which is a really important sport fish here in Minnesota and other parts of the northern US, and other native species. They damage infrastructure, cut swimmers' feet, just because they grow all over everything. We chose these 2 species because both cause very visible changes to lakes. So because we were doing an on-site survey, we wanted lakes that were infested with invasive species that just the average person coming to visit a lake could tell and could see that there were differences because of these invasive species. So we wanted to make it as easy as we could for people, and that was very important to us. Okay, so for our on-site survey, we looked at 4 different Minnesota lakes with different AIS infestations. So some had starry stonewort, some had zebra mussels, some had none. We did this last summer, summer of 2019, which is nice because all of our research has been put on hold for this summer because of COVID. So if we waited for this year, we probably wouldn't be able to do it. We surveyed recreationists, so that's just people going there to boat or swim or whatever they're doing at the lakes. Those are surveys that we're implementing. And what we're doing is we're trying to gather data on these perceptions, values, and willingness to pay for invasive species management. So choosing the lakes was very important and took a great deal of time. First we decided on the species, which I already discussed, but then we had to choose lakes based on this idea of being very similar except for one thing being different. And the one thing that we wanted to be different was the invasive species in the lake. Because we wanted to see if people's values and perceptions and willingness to pay were different depending on the type of invasive species that was invading the lake. So we really wanted 4 lakes that were totally identical, except one had starry stonewort, one had zebra mussels. But that's a little bit hard to do because, as many of you know, when lakes are very close to each other, they're more likely to have similar infestations. So it took a little bit of time, but with some help with the Department of Natural Resources and people on the ground, and people on the ground being some of our grad students who actually went out and took pictures for us. This was in May of last year, so don't feel so bad about it raining or snowing a couple days ago. And took videos to let us see like what these lakes look like, what their access points were, because we were only going to be using public access points, not private. So it was important that we made sure that the points were similar enough in terms of the attributes, so like parking, and that they had signage and these types of things. And we ultimately chose these 4 lakes. So Minnewaska and Coronis, which are sort of in central southern Minnesota, and Gull and Pokegama. Minnewaska and Coronis are more like local lakes, and Gull and Pokegama attract a larger amount of out-of-towners. At least that was our thought going into this. So they're more like vacation-y kind of lakes, although they all share similar attributes. So Minnewaska does have a very small amount of starry stonewort, but it's concentrated in one very small area. Whereas Coronis has a lot of starry stonewort. That's kind of like a poster child for starry stonewort. In the state of Minnesota, it was the first lake that had it in it. So it's very infested. And then for gull and Pokegama, we're comparing zebra mussels. So gull is very infested with zebra mussels. It's extremely clear. There's the shells just litter the beaches. Pokegama does not actually have any invasive species. Technically yet, it's connected to a waterway that does, but it doesn't have anything just yet. The little yellow dots are the cities that are nearby them. The little purple dots, which are on the lakes, those are the sites that we actually survey at. So they're all public access points managed by the Department of Natural Resources. We did different sites on different days and kind of went around the lakes, like depending on our schedule. So, and when I say about our schedule, so there's kind of a science to this, which I'm not going to go completely into, but when we're surveying, we rotated lakes, we rotated times, we rotated dates to try to get a very good sample size. We didn't want to just survey on Saturdays because we knew that would be a different population than the people who would show up on Tuesdays. We didn't want to just survey at 5 p.m. because that's going to be a different sample than the people who show up at 7 a.m. So we varied this quite a bit. All the names on here are all of our undergrad researchers, which were fantastic. And so we had quite a complicated system going on last summer. So who we're surveying are our recreationists. So up in the top right corner, you see I'm here with these two gentlemen. These are our very first people that took our survey. We were very grateful for them. Twisted their arm, kind of like getting your first dollar in the restaurant. These women are our undergraduate research assistants. This is Casey. She's our graduate student who was extremely helpful. But we had these students out at these lake sites actually talking to recreationists as they come up and surveying them. And you see in the lower left-hand side, the gentleman in the blue shirt is taking a survey. He's very sun protected, so that's good. And we let the undergrads have a little bit of fun occasionally. You can see that they had some canoes. They were actually out camping this entire time, so they camped for a week, go to the sites, go back to camp, that type of thing. So it sounds like a fun job to me, but I'm not sure if they enjoyed it all of the time, but they did a very good job. All right, so what were we asking? We asked a lot of different questions. The whole survey took about 8 minutes. I'm going to go through it in a minute with you folks so that you can see what it is exactly that we're asking. But we asked about visit patterns, like where you're from, how often you come here. Have you noticed any changes since you started coming here? We asked about public values and attitudes, what types of things that you valued about lakes in general. We asked about awareness and risk perception. So do you know what invasive species are in the lake? How risky do you think invasive species are for various different reasons? What you think about invasive species management. Should it be managed? Should we worry about something else? Boater behavior to see if they were engaging in invasive species, anti-invasive species behaviors. And also some questions about willingness to pay and some potential programs in order to fund local management. So that's important. All of the willingness to pay that we're talking about was centered on the lake that the people were at. So if they were at Gull Lake, we asked them, would you be willing to pay whatever amount for this program at Gull Lake? It was not a statewide program that we asked them about. It was specific to the local lake. This is our survey. Let's see if this works. All right. So you can see on the right-hand side the little computers or the little screen. So it's kind of what it looked like. We used iPads for this. So first, we just checked to see if they were stopping, if they had a boat, whether or not they agreed to take a survey. So this is important in terms of our response rate, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We only surveyed visitors age 18 and over. We let them know about how long it would take and just let them know that it was confidential and we weren't gathering anything about them. So this is for Gull Lake. So first we asked them if they were here for just a day trip, 1 or more nights, where they were coming from, their zip code, and then what activities they're participating in. So the most common were fishing and boating, although we had a lot of other activities. We had some interesting other responses, but we had a number here that varied. But yeah, fishing and boating were definitely the biggest ones. We asked them what their primary reason was. Then we asked them about boater behavior. So all of these 4 are required by the state. So you're supposed to conduct visual inspections, remove invasive species, drain the water. Sorry, avoid release of unwanted bait into the lake. We also asked them if they rinsed the boat with high pressure or hot water and dried it with a towel to dry. So these are recommended, but not everyone is required to do them. We asked them why they're visiting this lake. They prefer it. They like the fishing recreational opportunities. It's just a nicer lake. Someone suggested it, or it's close to their home. So this one's kind of interesting. So we asked them why they visit lakes in general. So you can see we have a scale here of not at all important up to extremely important. We have to be close to nature, be physically active, to be on my own. This one's going to become important later, but to be on my own one. To socialize, to view the scenery, get away from the demands of life, to relax, to experience silence and quiet. So they selected these, and they didn't have to answer all the questions too, so it'll advance even if they didn't ask all of them. We asked them if they visited the lake before, and then we asked them when they first visited the lake. This was interesting. I think, Amit, I'm not sure if you're there. I think we had some that were in the 20s. Or the 30s, I think, were the oldest ones. So some people have been there at these lakes for basically their whole lives. Pretty interesting. We asked them how often they came to the lake. And if they noticed any changes. So if you notice the water quality becoming worse, better fishing, has it gotten harder to get your boat through, water clarity, and habitat. And the undergrads were standing by, so if people weren't sure like what navigability meant, we were there to answer those types of questions. This one's going to become important later too. So we asked them what extent they believe aquatic invasive species are a problem in Minnesota as a whole, not at the specific lake, in Minnesota. So not a problem, slight problem, moderate, severe. We asked how much of a risk the invasive species pose to the following. So do people think invasive species are risky for habitat, recreational opportunities, waterways, economic viability, cost of water treatment, or water quality? So people selected whatever their values were. And then we asked how important it is to prevent the spread of invasive species. So again, like, do we need to prevent them from spreading around for all these different reasons? Habitat, recreation, waterways, ricers to be able to harvest in wild rice waters, costly water treatment, natural systems, clean water, heritage and identity of Minnesota, and natural beauty of Minnesota's waters. These 2 questions are kind of important from a social science perspective, which Amit can talk about a little bit later. Okay, then we showed them these pictures of these different species. So I should have mentioned milfoil. Milfoil is present at Minnewaska. And we wanted to have a third invasive species on here as well. So part of the reason that we asked them this, we just said, have you heard of these, is because we wanted to make sure that they understood what these species were and what the damages were of them, so that later on when we asked them about the willingness to pay, they kind of have an idea in their mind of what their funds are going to go towards. So there's a bit of repetitiveness with these because we're trying to make sure that they're actually reading it or doing the best that we can for them to get the information in here. So we showed them a little visual picture so that they understand like how bad the infestation is at their lake. So for Gull Lake, it's an extensive infestation of zebra mussels. So we just kind of show a lot of zebra mussels in Gull Lake. No milfoil, no starry stonewort. So depending on the lake, these all kind of differ. And again, I repeated this so they had an idea of the level of infestation, because we really wanted to know, as I said initially, if the infestation at the particular lake impacted their responses or was correlated with their responses. So we had to make sure that they knew that their infestations or had an idea of what the infestation level was. This was an important slide. So we told them that the state already spends about $4.70 a year per Minnesotan for aquatic invasive species. So if any of you guys in there, I think about half of you are from Minnesota. So you're all paying about $5 a year for invasive species already. Starting next year, which would be this year, 2020, we're collecting about $2 extra per boat for invasive species. So if you own a bunch of boats, you're going to be paying more. And then for comparison, Minnesotans spend about $4,500 a year for education and $220 on public safety. So these, just for the state fees, these don't account for any like local or county taxes or for any types of donations. So now we're getting into the willingness to pay. So we tell them that there's a proposed program to make the lake access fee-based on Gull Lake or whatever lake they're at, which would fund prevention, management, and containment. Pay stations would be installed at public lake access points, which would be unstaffed. The fees could not be used for any other purpose, and skipped payment could result in a fine. We also remind them that the survey results would be available to policymakers, so your answer has consequences. Then we ask them, would you pay a certain amount for public lake access? So this amount varied. It was random between it was between $8 and $13. And then depending on what you answered, you get a second question. So if you say yes, you get a higher value. If you said no, you get a lower value. And this was just so we could get a good distribution of our answers. We asked them what they would do to pay the fee and what they would prefer taxpayer funds to be sent on. So the remainder of the survey has to do with socio-demographics, like how old you are and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and skip those, but I'm happy to answer more questions about them later. Let me go ahead and go back to my presentation here. Okay, so sorry. Okay, so here's some of our results. So here's our different lakes. These are the N's are the number of surveyors that we had. So it kind of varied. So we had a lot at Minnewaska and Gull. We had 350 at Minnewaska, 273 at Gull. We had less at Pekegama and Corona, so 190, 180. We had a good response rate. So around 55, 60% of the people that we asked offered to take it. We were very happy with that. People can get very anxious when they're trying to get on the water or get off the water. So for them to take, 8 minutes to take a survey, we are very grateful for that. I understand that we're cutting into their recreation time, but it was very nice. They were very happy to answer our questions. And I'm sure it helped that we had nice, undergrads. I'm a student, help me. That can't hurt. So here's some of our results. So about 90% were white, 70% were male. 50% had a bachelor's degree or higher, and 70% had an annual income of more than $60,000. For the activities, fishing was the #1 primary activity. 60% said that they were there to fish. 40% said they were boating, sailing, kayaking. 25 were swimming, water sports, 22, and socializing, like 16, 17. The other ones were very low, art and hiking and that stuff. We were at boat access ramps, so clearly we're going to get a lot of people who are actually going out on the water as opposed to like biking around or that type of thing. However, if those people came by, we surveyed them as well. So these are our values. So the percent, or the y-axis there is the percent of very to extremely important. So 80% said that clean water was very to extremely important. A little less than that was habitat for native fish. The natural beauty of Minnesota's waters. About 70% was high quality recreational opportunities, and the same for the heritage and identity of Minnesota. So these things are very important to people overall. These are our risk perceptions. So this is the percent of high to extreme risk. So you can see that 60% think that AIS specifically are risky in terms of the habitat for native fish. Water quality of Minnesota's lakes and streams goes down a little bit for cost of water treatment, quality of recreational opportunities, and then about 40% is navigability of waterways. So these are a little bit lower. Okay, so here's some results. I know there's a lot going on here. Forgive me for all that, but basically all you need to know is that there's a line kind of going downward. And what this is saying is that if you saw a low value, what was the chance that you would say yes? So if you saw $1, people said, if our survey asked you, would you pay $1 for invasive species management at Gull Lake in order to access the water? 90% said yes. However, that got way down. So once you start getting into the upper 15, 20, it gets down to like 10, 12%. So that makes sense. The cheaper it is, the more people are gonna agree. This is some gobbledygook I'm happy to talk about later, but essentially what we used a regression format and some probability distribution functions to figure out what the average willingness to pay was. The reason we had to bring the probability distribution into it is because we couldn't ask every person every single value, so we had to kind of guess based on what they answered. So if they said yes to $3, we know that they would pay $1 and $2, but we're not sure if they would pay $4, $5, $6, or $7. So we had to do a little bit of work here to estimate it. But what we ended up with was that the estimated mean daily willingness to pay was $10. So people are willing to pay $10 essentially for a parking fee for the day to fight invasive species at that lake that they were at. However, pretty good chunk of them were not willing to pay anything. And most of those were protest votes, meaning that it wasn't that they didn't care about invasive species, it's just that they were offended by the idea of having to pay, which is legitimate. These are free public access points, so a lot of people it's wrong, morally wrong, and illegal to have a fee on them. So I totally get that. However, what was really interesting is there's no significant difference between any of the lakes in terms of daily willingness to pay. So it didn't matter if you were at a lake that was infested with zebra mussels, starry stonewort, or nothing, you're willing to pay the same amount. So I think, Patrick, we're gonna do a little game here. Megan, am I doing okay on time? Do I need to speed up?
Yep, you're doing good. We're about 25 minutes in or so. So
okay, great.
Another 5 or 10 minutes, yeah.
Great. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is guess for me. People who made more money, do you think that they were willing to pay more or less than the same as people who made less money? You can vote on the little poll that popped up. So this is saying, like, is a richer person going to be willing to pay more than a less rich person? Oh, okay, so we got an even distribution. 33, 35. Yeah, so actually, it is a little bit more. However, it's not a whole lot more. So you'll see that 285. That is the difference between someone who makes the least amount, which was under 20,000, and someone who makes the most amount, which I think was over 250,000. So someone who makes over 250,000 is only willing to pay $2 more than someone who makes under 20,000. So you're all kind of right. Okay, now remember I mentioned that to be on your own earlier. So people who rank to be on their own as extremely important, do you think they're, as opposed to everyone else, or as opposed to people who were rated it as not important, do you think that they're willing to pay more or less or the same? Ah, yeah, okay. This one surprised both me and Amit. It's actually less, quite a bit less, $4 less. That one is kind of a humdinger for us. We're trying to figure out why exactly that is. It may be related, you know, and Amit can answer this. I'm not sure if he's around, but there's a theory that people who kind of take ownership of a place, which may be related to ranking, saying that they want to be by themselves, that they kind of feel offended at having to pay for it. So that might be one of the reasons. Okay, concern. People who thought invasive species were a severe problem versus people who did not, were they willing to pay more or less or the same? It was kind of fun. I like these polls. So severe problem. More, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yep. So quite a bit more, $6 more. Mm-hmm. What about proximity? Do you think people who live on the lake or nearby the lake are willing to pay more, less, or the same as the people who are visiting? Now, I'm going to give you a little hint here. I want you to remember that this is a daily fee. So every time you go to the lake, you have to pay this, or every time you park there. More or less, yeah, I kind of split the same. So actually it is less. The reason it's less, we think, is because if you go to a lake, if you live next to a lake, you're probably going to go there more often. So even though you may care more about the lake, maybe because you live there, because you visit frequently, you don't want to have to pay $10, you know, you go there every day, you don't want to pay $10 every day. That's going to be $70 a week versus someone who's visiting from out of town. They're like, ah, well, yeah, sure, I'll pay $10. I'm only going to be here once a year. Okay, education. More educated people. Are the more educated people willing to pay, more formally educated people, I should say, are they willing to pay more or less than less formally educated people? What do you guys think? More. Actually, it's the same. Yeah, so if you, it didn't matter. Oh no, I gave it away. Sorry, we missed one. So this one was invasive species knowledge. So people who knew the correct invasive species in the lake versus people who did not know were actually not willing to pay any more. So if you knew there was zebra mussels in Gull Lake, it didn't impact how much you were willing to pay. All right, what about people who perceived invasive species as the most risky versus people who didn't perceive invasive species as risky at all? Do you think they're willing to pay more or less of the same? Let's see, what do you guys think? Or, yeah, right, yeah, very good, right, more, a lot more, $5 more. Ooh, now this is an interesting one, okay? What do you think about the initial value offered? So remember when I said it's a random value? So the first one you got was between 8 and 13. Then if you said yes, you got between 14 and 20. If you said no, you got between 1 and 7. So do you think if you were given, say, 13 versus 8, what would your ultimate willingness to pay be? Would it be higher, lower, or the same? This one has to do a little bit with psychology. Yeah, and this one's a weird one, right? So you guys are all kind of split, more or less the same. It's actually more. So your ultimate willingness to pay is about 40 cents more per dollar. So we think this has to do, kind of think of it like clothes that go on sale or something. Like if you, or like let's say you're shopping on Amazon and you don't want to pick like the cheapest thing, you know, you want to pick like maybe the second or third cheapest thing. It's because we think that the value stuff is offered at has something, the price something's offered at has something to do with the value. So likely if we say, hey, are you willing to pay $13 for invasive species? People are like, oh, invasive species must be worth something. So there's a little bit of a psychology thing going on there as well, which I thought was kind of interesting. Very good, you guys did great. This is I'm glad we do this poll. This is like super weird to be talking. I can't hear anyone in the audience at all. Okay, so again, here's our results. Our average was $10, and again, there was no difference in between the lakes. However, there were some differences between the lakes, just not in terms of the willingness to pay. So the most significant difference was the knowledge. So we asked people, you know, do you know what's in the lake? People at Coronis and Gull were higher, or was a bigger chance that they'd know. And we think that's just because Coronis is pretty famous for having starry stonewort, and Gull is pretty famous for having zebra mussels. Whereas Minnewaska, you know, they have some zebra mussels, they have some milfoil. It's a little bit unclear. And then Pokegama doesn't have anything. So people might have thought we were trying to play a trick on them and asking them what was in the lake, even though none was an option. So We think that might be why. We also noticed that perceived risk was slightly higher. It was significantly different, but just ever so slightly higher at Coronis and Pokegama as compared to Bull and Minnewaska. So again, we think Coronis might be related to how kind of famous it is for starry stonewort, and Pokegama is a pristine lake. So perhaps people that are visiting there are more concerned about it because nothing is in the lake. We're not totally sure about why these are. So just some kind of thoughts. I think I'm coming right up on my 30 minutes here. And hopefully you guys will have a bunch of questions. But the main one, which surprised us, was that local infestations are probably not as important as overall perspective. So if you're at a lake that's infested with this or that, that might not be as important as how you think about AIS overall, even as it relates to your support for local management, which is pretty interesting. Like I mentioned with those protest votes and the legality of all this, doing something like this or having a fee, you know, there's a lot of other concerns besides just if people are willing to pay for it. And the big one is that, you know, education can work. And we showed that people who perceive invasive species as more of a problem and more risky are willing to pay more. So, you know, if you can convince people to increase their perceived risk or increase the problem that they see, then they'll likely have more support for invasive species management. All right, so thank you guys very much. I'd say you've been a good audience, but I don't know yet. But yeah, Megan?
Great. Thanks so much, Lucy. Yes, we do have some questions that have rolled in. So I've mentioned it in the chat. If you have not yet found the chat, if you wiggle your mouse around, you'll see some controls pop up. So look for chat in the bottom. And you can type your questions in that screen. We're tracking them, and I'm going to start pitching those questions to Lucy. And if Amit is here, he'll pop his microphone on and jump in as he's able to. So Lucy, the first questions that I have relate to your study design. One of the questions was wondering why you chose random values for how much people would be willing to pay when that was first popping up in that survey, rather than like a range or a static number.
Right, so the idea is just so that we can try and pinpoint down a little bit more exactly. So traditionally, before we had access to this type of technology, we would have had paper surveys. And when you have paper surveys, they would have like one or two values. So it might say, are you willing to pay $10? Are you willing to pay $5? What that does is it narrows what you can do mathematically. So if you only have a couple values, you can only really say, well, we know the people who would pay 10 and the people who would pay 5, but what about all these other numbers? Would they pay more than 10? Would they pay between 5 and 10? Like, what can we do with that? But when we have the random values, it's really cool because we have the opportunity to not only get this wide range of initial values, but then we can tailor our secondary question. So if they say, no, I'm not willing to pay $10, then we can ask them a lower value. So say, okay, what about 5? Then we get more information about that person and more information to build our model more accurately. If you did it with paper, it would be a big mess. It would just be like a disaster to try to print all that stuff off. But luckily, with the technology that we have available to now, we can do that. So we can really pinpoint stuff down more specifically. That's a really good question, though. We were really excited about it. And one of the reasons we wanted to use iPads.
All right. Great. So the next question was wondering, as you did your survey, how you were able to differentiate between the part-time user or the part-time lake residents and visitors.
So we asked the question at the beginning, and I actually noticed there was the one that I showed you, there was an error on. So when we asked them if they lived at the lake, or if they were only visiting the lake for a few hours, or if they were visiting from somewhere else. So we just asked them, and we also asked them for their zip code, so we could tell where exactly they lived, because that was important, and you can see that that became important later on, because the people who live closer by, we assume that they go more often, and we did ask about that, and those were correlated. So in terms of a daily fee, if this were actually to happen, I'm sure that they would do something for local residents where you pay for the summer or something like that. You're not going to be paying like every time you go park. but that was just a little too complicated for us to ask in our survey. So just to simplify it, we just asked everyone the same questions.
Great. And then did you know, was the average willingness to pay based, were you calculating that only on the people who were willing to pay something, or were there protest votes counted as like $0, or were they just fully removed from that calculation?
That's a really good question. I should have clarified that more. So some of the 0 votes we did include, some we did not. So I left the survey before we got to that, but if you said no to both willingness to pay questions, if you said, I'm not gonna pay $9, I'm not gonna pay $1, we then asked them why. So some of the answers to why were things like, you know, I don't believe in taxes, or stuff like that. And some of them were just that I don't think we should pay for invasive species management. So if they said something like, I just don't have any value for this, I don't think we should pay for invasive species management, or something like, I can't afford this, we considered those true zeros, meaning that they either couldn't afford it or they didn't have value for it. But if it was something like, you know, I don't believe in paying taxes, or I pay too much money in taxes, or stuff like that, those are considered protest votes, which kind of means that people are just going to say no to everything because they just don't want to pay any more money to the government. So we excluded some of the zeros, but the ones that we found to be real zeros, we kept in. That's a really good question.
Great. Okay, I have a couple of questions next about your results. One of them was wondering how you might be able to figure for people who leave their boats on the same lake all summer. So for example, they may not be using a public launch throughout.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And that was, you know, part of what's frustrating, well, part of what's awesome and frustrating about Minnesotan lakes is that there are so many access points. I mean, basically like the entire lake shore is filled with access points. So we were only able to survey people who were using those public access points. So we can't say for sure that people who live on the lakes or who use private access points would feel the same way because we did not survey them. However, we do have a secondary part of this project, which is a mail survey, which will get at some of this and it'll be distributed. So we'll pick up some of those people. And we're also submitting a proposal to do work with tourists at tourist locations that have private access points. And we've also secured funding from the USGS to survey people who live on lakes. So they actually own their own access points. So that's a very good question to the person that answered that, and we're on it. we don't know yet, but we're working on it.
Great. And then could you talk more about the potential relationship between differing use patterns and willingness to pay? Thinking about, for example, groups like fishermen that may visit many more lakes during the summer, and if they have a different idea of the impacts of invasive species.
So we found that people who selected that to be on my own, that was, it was, let me see if I remember this correctly. That was correlated with choosing fishing as a primary reason to be on the lake. But it had a stronger impact than fishing as a primary reason did. So in our ultimate model, we removed fishing and just had to be on our own. But if you flipped it and did not, if you took to be on my own out and put fishing as a primary use, the model fit wasn't quite as good, but it indicated that, yeah, people who chose fishing as their primary reason were willing to pay less overall than people who did not. And yeah, you're exactly right. We think that that's the reason. It has to do with how often they're out there, and that, right, they go around to a lot of different lakes. And we did not ask them those types of questions. We only asked them about the specific lake we were at, so we don't know how many lakes they go to or that type of thing. But we think a lot of that does have to do with that the fees would kind of start to pile up. And people who own boats and fishing, remember they are paying more for invasive species than people who do not because of the tag fees.
Great. Great. And I think you kind of started to get to this point about people who may visit lakes more frequently and how that can add up for them. So some of the questions have been wondering about if there was any evaluation in there about the potential for an annual fee for frequent lake users.
Yeah, and so we had a ton of people ask that, and you know, if this were to happen in real life, I definitely think that's what would occur. People would be able to buy like annual passes and that type of thing. But unfortunately, we didn't really have the capacity, and we didn't want to make the survey like super long, so we weren't able to ask annual fee questions in there. But we did ask them how often they went to the lake. So we did kind of a rudimentary like multiplication, like, oh, if I went once a week versus once a month, we could kind of multiply it out and figure out what their total willingness to pay over the season was. I can't remember what those values are off the top of my head, but we do have some information about them. I think they're maybe around $50, something like that, that people are kind of would be willing to pay maybe for a year. But so yeah, that's a very good question. And yeah, unfortunately, we had to cut it at some point. We figured we could kind of figure it out from the daily fees, but it'd be harder to go back from the annual to the daily. So that's why we went that direction.
Sure, great. And then can you talk more about what you're hoping to have happen with these results? So how do you see them being implemented? What are you hoping that decision makers might be able to learn from the results that you're sharing?
Well, I think the number one thing that I would like people to learn, and I hope policymakers and the public kind of get from this, is that people who are visiting lakes in Minnesota, I mean, they really care about invasive species. They care about invasive species management. They don't like the impacts that invasive species are having. And they have like value for them, both in terms of their social values, but also in terms of that they're actually willing to pay money for these things, as long as they can be assured that the money is going to be going towards invasive species management. So I think there's a big fear sometimes among people anytime you say something like a fee or a tax that everyone is gonna flip out. But you know, that's not what we found at all. I mean, people, they want this stuff to happen and they're willing to pay for it. And I think that's a really important lesson. Sometimes I think that we perceive environmental causes or things as maybe people, the average person not caring about, or only city people caring about or something, but that's not true. You know, there's people out on these lakes. These lakes are very important to people, and I hope that the study helps pound that point in. And then yeah, maybe we can start to get some programs and figure out how to actually generate some more funds. I mean, right now we're spending what, $5 a year per person? It's pretty low. So I think we're going to have to realize that we're going to have to pump some money into this stuff if we want to fight these things.
Yeah, and I think, hi all, this is Amit here. Just wanted to chime in about, hopefully this also answers this other question around, what kind of educational efforts are most effective. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping folks will get out of this study is also that, when we say education, it's not necessarily about just sharing information. Because we've also found that just the basic knowledge about AIS doesn't necessarily affect people's behaviors. And we've kind of known this, as an environmental psychologist for decades now, that just throwing information and facts at people doesn't necessarily affect their behaviors at all. So when we say education, it's more about targeted communication approaches. So, when we found things like, if people are more concerned about this problem, if they think it's a problem, then they're more likely to take action. So it's really about, communicating why AIS is a problem, where are the risks of AIS, rather than just throwing facts about, another obscure species that people don't necessarily have a direct connection with. So again, it's trying to find the connections with people and the impacts of AIS that people care about, whether it's navigability, whether it's water quality or habitat protection. So again, focusing, I think, education, outreach, and more of an engagement model of trying to involve people in AIS management than a straightforward, here's a fact sheet, here's information about this particular species, and then wondering why people aren't taking those actions, which obviously, even within our bubble, it seems like everyone should be doing this.
Great.
Thanks, Amit.
Thank you, and glad to hear you being able to join in. I'll pop on to our next questions. Do you know if there was a correlation between people who may be coming from more urban environments versus those in rural areas, or any other regional differences in the willingness to pay?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So we have the data in terms of the zip code that people are coming from, and also if they're coming from, you know, a friend's house or a resort or camping, that type of thing. We haven't run that information yet. So this is also, there's this segment of it, and it's also part of our grad students' master thesis. But we'll have more information about that hopefully by June, I think, when we generate our final report. So we don't know yet, but we have the data. We just haven't pressed enter yet in our model. It's a very good question, though.
Great. And did you see if there was also a difference in the willingness to pay between consumptive users like anglers versus non-consumptive users like just people who are out recreational boating?
So we didn't ask them, we asked them if they were out there fishing or boating. So we ran all those different activities in the model. And we found that the factors that we included, that we showed in the little chart, were stronger and created a better model fit than actually including the uses. However, yeah, we found that, like I said, that people who chose fishing, that was correlated with willing to pay less. There was something like when they were out there doing art, they were willing to pay more, but the numbers were so, they're so low that we couldn't do anything with it. It wasn't significant. So there definitely was a difference between people's uses of the lake, but it fit better when we use those different values that we included in the final model. But that's an interesting question.
And as you were looking at the results, did you notice if it was common for boaters or users to respond that aspects of the lake, like clarity, had improved since their first visit, or any trends along those lines?
Yeah, thank you. So that is part of our grad student's master thesis. So she hasn't, I haven't seen the results of that yet, but that's something that we're very curious about. That question, and also about the boater behavior we're looking into, because there was 5 or 6 things on there, and 4 of them are required, 2 of them are not required. And we were curious to see what would make people do or say that they did the 2 not required ones. And we thought it might be related to if they'd seen changes in the lake over time. That's a really good question. And again, we're on it.
Great. And then, so
smart.
So as far as extrapolating these results out further, do you have any sense on what this data might mean for either other parts of Minnesota or other parts of the country, or perhaps other countries? I know we have people from Canada joining as well.
Yeah, you know, this is pretty interesting. And both Amit and I are originally from outside of Minnesota, so it's been an interesting perspective for us. And we're not sure if there's something, you know, about Minnesotans that are making them answer in a certain way. I mean, clearly we know that Minnesota has a lot of lakes, and there's a lot of lake-based recreation that occurs in Minnesota as compared to some more arid regions. So we're not really sure how applicable this would be to other examples. It would be really interesting to see if it was the case in some areas that weren't as lakey as Minnesota is. We just don't know. However, we're going to get some information about that in our mail survey, because our mail survey is being sent out. Again, not right now because of COVID, but you know, after this dies down, that we'll be asking, you know, just a general resident survey. And we're going to be getting a lot of people in there who don't go to lakes. You know, a lot of Minnesotans don't go to lakes, you know. So that will give us some better information, I think, about how applicable this is to other areas, to see what those people who don't recreate at lakes think about invasive species. That's a really good question.
Yeah, and I think, just chiming in, I think also beyond kind of the socio-demographics and, you know, who does what activities and where they're coming from and so forth, I think the other part that is very transferable and applicable potentially to other areas are kind of the links between the psychological and social aspects and people's beliefs and attitudes about invasive species and what kind of actions they might take. And, you know, I think the socio-demographics provides a good context for all of that. But even just looking at the links between, you know, if people believe there's more of a risk, they're more likely to take certain types of actions is enough a useful information that could be kind of translated and used in other areas as well.
Thanks, Amit.
All right. Okay, and I see a question here from someone in Michigan who looks like they have an interesting idea coming out of Michigan as a way to get funding for AIS, where it looks like this is an optional fee that you could add on to your watercraft registration. Kind of I'm an AIS, I'm helping fight AIS with like a sticker to kind of show that you're contributing. And they're wondering if this survey might give some indications on what amount of money might be a good place where they might get at least half the respondents to contribute.
Yeah, I think, you know, we asked about daily. I think you'd have to do a little bit of calculus there and figure out, okay, if these people are willing to pay these daily fees. The problem is that the fees that we asked about were focused on the local lake that they were at. So we're not sure how that all applies to willing to pay fees overall in the state. It seems like people would be willing to pay, like logically that people would be willing to pay more for the entire state than they would for just one lake. But I don't think that's actually how people really think about these things. Like if there's a lake they really like to go to, they'll be like, yeah, I'll pay for that lake, but I don't want to give money to the state because they're going to waste it. So we could probably calculate something out, figure out like how often they come and you know, therefore how many boats they have and how much does that equate to in terms of a sticker. But it would be hard, the local versus statewide thing would be a bit of an issue, I think.
All right, great. Let's see. So, and as you're looking at your results again, did you see, was there a higher value placed on treatment when they were given that option to select where that funding should go versus other groups based on the activity of the respondents?
Yeah. Oh man, Amit, do you remember? I can't off the top of my head.
Yeah, we certainly have that information in there somewhere. We just haven't gotten to analyzing and slicing the data in all these different ways. But that's definitely something we can look into more, is kind of the willingness around prevention versus treatment.
Yeah, right. We didn't include it in the model. We did look at just like averages, like the percent of people that chose each one, but I can't remember what they are. But I can send that to that person. I have that somewhere.
And I think there's just some research. So this was some of the research done in Spain where people were more willing to pay for eradication. I think because in that case, it was more of a tangible, you know, more visible kind of actions that people are taking right away. But then I think that the context there becomes really important of, you know, where, what lake and which areas, and is prevention more important issue than eradication and control.
All right. So this may be along the same lines, but did you notice or were you able to record the popularity of the lakes that you were doing these surveys on, and if there was a difference in willingness to pay based on that popularity?
So we have data in terms of how many people we contacted. And certain lakes there were definitely more people at than others. And we didn't find that to be significant in terms of willingness to pay, interestingly enough, which kind of surprised us. But part of the thing, again, is we were only asking people at those public boat launches too. So we don't know if people that were coming, you know, probably people that are coming from really far away, maybe they don't have their own boat, so they might be at private launches. So we don't have any data about those people. But yeah, just in terms of all the lakes had almost identical answers. So I think Minnewaska and, was it Gull, I think, were the most popular. And yeah, they had the same answers as the people of the other two lakes.
All right. And then have you been working with Minnesota DNR as you've been done this? And we have some people wondering what kind of support or feedback you're getting from them.
Yeah, so DNR has been really helpful. So they, it was quite a process to choose these lakes. So in addition to the survey aspects of it, to make sure that we had good data, you know, we had to make sure that they were safe for the surveyors. We had to make sure that they had amenities for the undergrads that were out there. You know, we didn't want them to starve to death while they're surveying lakes. And we had to make sure that we had enough of a flow of visitors that it would be worth our time. So initially we started off with 2 other lakes that we ended up not going to after the first week because we just didn't have enough data points coming from them. And DNR was extremely helpful with all of that. And they also conducted training for our undergrads. So we actually took them out and showed them starry stonewort, we showed them zebra mussels. We showed them boat launches and all that type of stuff so that we made sure they were familiar with it. So DNR has been really great. We also camped at you know, state parks the entire time, which are run by DNR. There was some concern about DNR, obviously, because they wanted to make sure that people knew that we were University of Minnesota and not them. And we were grateful for that too, because there's definitely, I think, a more positive response from the public to UMN students than there are to the DNR people. And we saw that because sometimes DNR people would be on site as well, and we were definitely treated a lot better. But DNR, yeah, they've been really interesting. We haven't really talked to them besides the information that Mazurk has put out about the results of our survey. So we are kind of curious to see what they think about it. Unfortunately, we haven't had a chance to have that. I don't know, the DNR people, maybe they're in here, they can, yeah, email me.
That sounds great. Thanks, Lucy. So I actually let us go 2 minutes over time. So I'll, there were some people asking for contact information. So showing on the screen now, you can see that both for Amit and Lucy. And if you have questions about the webinar itself or the AIS Detectors program or for the webinar hosts, our email address is showing as on the screen as well. That's aisdetectors@umn.edu. We did record this webinar. So once we're done with the closed captioning, we'll make that available and an email will come out via Eventbrite for everyone who registered to the link to go back and view that. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is z.umn.edu/AISTube. And you'll get a notification as soon as it goes live there. Really want to thank everyone for joining us today, and for those whose questions we weren't able to get to, I apologize for that. I honestly don't know if we even were able to get to 50% of the questions that came in. We had a really great turnout today, so sorry for those who we weren't able to get to. But again, a big thanks to Lucy and Amit for joining us and sharing what they've had to learn with everyone. So thanks, and we'll hope to see you all at our next webinar.
Thanks, guys.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for your time.